Order. Welcome, Prime Minister. This session will have two parts to it. One on foreign affairs, in which we'll deal with countries affected by Islamist extremism and Ukraine. And in the second part of the session, we'll be dealing with the capacity and flexibility of the civil service and the machinery of government. And I'm going to ask Mr. Ottaway to begin.
Prime Minister, afternoon. Can we return to the subject of sanctions against Russia, which you touched on during your statement yesterday afternoon? It's very important that the EU speaks with one voice on the policy towards Russia, especially on sanctions. The sanctions are due to expire at the end of July, and I believe you're trying to get an earlier agreement than that. But there are a number of different positions inside Europe. We've got people like Germany and ourselves taking quite a hard line, we've got some in the middle, and some are actually rather hostile to it, like Greece and Hungary. How are we going to approach this in order to try and get unanimity?
Well, it's going to be difficult because the European Council on these issues works on the basis of unanimity. And so when these sanctions expire, you need unanimity to renew them. And I think I'm right in saying there's one set that have to be renewed in July and another set renewed in September. And there is a case, as I was saying yesterday in the Commons, to bring forward the renewal, particularly if there's further action by Russians and Russian separatists on the ground. There's an argument for bringing them forward in order to make a very strong statement. I think the way to achieve unanimity is to point people to the facts. I mean, we gathered at the European Council last time after Minsk II was signed, and Angela Merkel and François Hollande and Petro Poroshenko came from that meeting to brief the European Council, and they were rightly congratulated for having put together at least a diplomatic deal. What happened next after that was the horrors of Debaltseve, and I think that shows who we're dealing with and how firm we need to be, and I think we need to use all our diplomatic and other skills and efforts to convince those that have been more sceptical about sanctions that it's only a firm stand that will be taken notice of in the Kremlin. So that's what we should do. We've got some time to do it. Britain has quite an important role to play in all of that. We have been, as I put it, the strong pole in the tent in terms of sanctions. We should continue to play that role.
Are you optimistic that they will be extended?
I think I'm always optimistic. I think some of it will depend on what happens on the ground. I think that if miraculously heavy weapons are withdrawn, ceasefires are held, elections start, all the elements of Minsk were put in place, I think you'd see people wanting to lighten the sanctions load. But if we don't see that, you'll get a different view. But I think, as I say, Britain's role is to be at the tougher end of the spectrum, to try and keep the European Union and the United States together. And I think we should be clear about this pattern of behaviour we've seen from Putin now over many years. And that's the argument. When I'm at the European Council table, that's the argument I make.
Do you think you will simply extend them, or will you deepen them, make them tougher?
I think the extension should happen in any event, even if not very much changes on the ground. They should be deepened if further steps of destabilisation are taken. I think particularly people will be looking at Mariupol as a next potential flashpoint, and if that were to happen, I think the argument for further action would be overwhelming. And I think that would be the view of countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and many others. And I think we'd have to argue very strongly that if you stand back from all this, what's the argument we're making? Of course, there is short-term pain when you put sanctions on a country. There's short-term pain to your own economies. But the argument I always make is that in the medium to long term, the countries of Europe depend on a rules-based system where people obey the rules. And the instability we will yield if we don't stand up to Russia in the long term will be deeply damaging to all of us. Because you'll see further destabilisation. Next it'll be Moldova or one of the Baltic states. And that sort of instability and uncertainty will be dreadful for our economies, dreadful for our stability, and that's why Britain takes such a clear view.
The Foreign Secretary said the other day that Russia can no longer be considered a strategic partner to the EU. Doesn't this cause us a few problems? Because as a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia, they're involved in a number of global issues, in particular Iran, with Syria, Afghanistan. How do we square this circle?
I think it's a very good question. I don't think Russia is behaving like a strategic partner to the European Union. That's absolutely right. And so we should be very tough on this issue. Look, where we are working together, as we are with the approach to Iran, we should continue to work together. It's very important that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, and it's very important we keep a long timeline between wherever they are now and a nuclear weapon, and Russia has the same interest as us in that. So it is perfectly possible to have a very tough approach over sanctions, over the overall relationship, while, when it comes to Iran, continuing to work in this format of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany.
Can we move to the Baltics and have a look at the use of Article 5? If the Russians start to destabilise the region through the use of unconventional warfare, say cyber warfare, proxy forces, media disinformation, does Article 5 offer them any protection?
Well, I think the protection they're offered in those circumstances is that we are friends, we're allies, we're colleagues. Already we've sent British planes to do the Baltic air policing. We work very closely with their intelligence and security services, very fruitfully too. On things like cyber, we'll work with them and help them strengthen their defences. So, they know, and maybe we need to do more to emphasise this, they know that in Britain they've got a very strong friend. And I think if you talk to the Latvian, Lithuanian or Estonian leaders, you'd hear that pretty strongly.
Implementing Article 5 is essentially a political decision rather than a military one. But what would it take for us to say that the line in the sand has been drawn? If militias started operating just over the border in any of the Baltic states, would we consider that as a breach of Article 5? In which case, what would our reaction be?
I think that's a very good question, and I don't want to give some unthought-through answer. But, we are committed to their collective defence. And so where they are being destabilised, we would intervene and help them with their stability. Where they're being cyber-attacked, we would help them with their cyber defences. I think we need to do more, frankly, in the area of information. One of the complaints you get from the Baltic states is that, there's nothing to counter the deluge of sort of Russian paid and backed media spreading disinformation. And we have to recognise one of the strengths we've got as a country, although we don't always necessarily feel it this way, is we have a very strong and impartial media. We have a wonderful brand in the BBC that's known for its impartial news, and we should be supporting the BBC to provide news services and news channels where people otherwise are getting a diet of Russian disinformation.
Can I go back to the question, though? But if militia activity did start over the border, would we consider that a breach of Article 5?
Well, we consider those sorts of threats to states, we would consider that something that we would be helping them to defend against.
How should we respond to Russian incursions into airspace and territorial waters? We had the bears coming up the channel the other day. Do we shrug it off and rise to the bait, or do we treat it as a more serious threat to our ability to respond?
Of course it's serious, because we defend our airspace very carefully, and we have the resources, the pilots, the planes, the information systems to do just that. I think we should be careful that in our response we are clear, firm, calm. I'm sure the Russians would like us to react, in a more sort of voluminous way about it. I was checking on the figures. I mean, so far this year, the RAF has scrambled the quick reaction aircraft twice. Last year, it was 8 times. Go back to 2011, it was 10 times. In 2007, it was 19 occasions. So I think, we should be strong, measured and clear, but we should be absolutely confident that in our Air Force and in the Typhoons and the pilots that we have, we've got 125 Typhoon now in service, we are more than capable of protecting our airspace.
The Defence Secretary had something to say about both of these points during his airborne briefing to the Times and the Telegraph. Was he misunderstood, or was he spot on when he said there was a real and present danger of Russian activity in the Baltic states of the kind that Mr. Otto has referred to?
I think he's right to highlight the fact that the Baltic states feel this pressure very greatly, and they don't always feel the rest of Europe understands them. From where they sit, they're having Russian sanctions against some of their goods, bans on Lithuanian cheese. They're having Russian media blast them into their airspace. They often have cyber attacks. They are subject to a lot of destabilization, and they want their NATO partners and friends and allies to understand that, and that's why they welcome, as I said yesterday, we've got 4,000 British troops taking part in exercises in Eastern Europe. We've got the Baltic Air Patrol missions. We're doing a lot to try and reassure them that they are full members of NATO. They get NATO protection in every way, and we're with them when they face these struggles.
So real and present danger were the right words, were they?
Look, I think he spoke very clearly, and as I say, he's right to talk about the threats they feel.
And on the incursions into our airspace, which, as you say, have gone on for years, he said of the Cold War, in relation to that it looks like it's warming up. Is that spot on?
Well, look, I've given you the figures. Clearly, as I said the other day, I think the Russians are probably trying to make some sort of point. I'm not entirely sure what point it is. I believe in reacting very calmly, reasonably. Look, we should be confident of our strength. Our economy is growing. The Russian economy is shrinking. Our economy is not wholly dependent on oil. The Russian economy is wholly dependent on oil. Our country has a robust, free, democratic political system with the freedom of speech and all sorts of rights that people only dream of in Russia. Let's have the confidence. Our economy is bigger than Russia, right? Even though the population is many times the size of ours. Our economy is fully capable of supporting the fifth largest defence forces in the world that are highly capable. We don't have all sorts of legacy assets that don't work anymore. Let's have confidence. And when we look at this situation, terrible though it is in Ukraine, let us not talk ourselves into some idea that this has all been a fantastic success for Russia. It hasn't been. The people of Ukraine have voted to try to have a more open, democratic, less corrupt trading and other relationship with the countries of the European Union. This is, so we shouldn't talk ourselves, because a couple of Russian planes fly around the channel, we shouldn't sort of talk ourselves into a sort of situation where we think somehow we can't defend ourselves. We absolutely can.
Wars between states tend to start when one side doesn't understand the position being taken by the other, or indeed both.
Yes.
Don't you think we have to have a pretty clear understanding of what Russia's intentions are? And doesn't President Putin need to have a pretty clear understanding that NATO will respond decisively on any incursion in the Baltic states?
That's a very good point. Look, I think President Putin absolutely knows that we would stand by our Article 5 obligations. If a country of NATO is attacked, an attack on one is an attack on all. That is NATO doctrine. I sign up to it absolutely, and that is what we have committed to as a nation. And we are a leading player in NATO in terms of troops and resources and everything else. So Richard was asking me very sort of technical questions about what exactly is. Look, but as I say, if there's a cyber attack on a Baltic state, as far as I'm concerned, yes, that does trigger all of us trying to help them with their cyber defences. So, but I'm being as clear as I possibly can, but Putin absolutely knows NATO is rock solid. We had an excellent NATO conference in South Wales. He knows that if he attacks a NATO country, he would have a response from the whole of NATO. Article 5 would be triggered. He knows that. Now, do we understand his strategic goals? I would argue that we've now seen a very clear pattern of behaviour. We saw it in Georgia with the creation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. We've seen it with Transnistria. We're now seeing it with Ukraine. That he would like, if countries respond weakly, to try and restore some of the Russia near abroad to Russia. That is what he'd like to do. In my view, that is not acceptable. These countries are democracies. They should be able to make a choice about their future, and we should support them in the choice that they make. That is not to say we are insensitive to Russian pride and Russia's ambition to have a role in the world. Of course we're not, and I've tried to have a relationship with Putin and show some understanding of that. But what we can't do is, I think some people would like us to do this, is sort of say, well, let's have some sort of accommodation where we say to Russia, well, of course, these countries are the near abroad. I mean, they're not really countries. Of course, they're your domain. Whatever they vote for, whatever they do, you can. I think that would be writing off, 11, 12, 13 countries in the world, and I think that's not the way Britain behaves. And we made these mistakes in our history of talking about faraway countries of which we knew little. And it is not a sensible thing to do. Now, we should, I'm not saying we should send huge numbers of British troops to Ukraine, or even that we're at the stage of arming the Ukrainians. But what we should do is make the weight of our economic power, that Europe and America play against Russia if they continue to behave in this way. So they're very clear. So Putin knows that if he continues down this path, he's going to have a very different relationship with Europe, with Britain, with America, with the West. And if he wants to take the consequences of that, which is further economic dislocation, less economic growth, less prosperity for his people, if he wants to take that path, then he can, but that will be the result.
Mr. Whittingdale.
Prime Minister, returning specifically to Ukraine, last week I spent 3 days in Kiev and saw Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who told me that he regarded Britain, alongside America, as Ukraine's strongest ally. However, he also said that his country has been invaded and that the Ukrainian armed forces are confronting not just separatists, but regular Russian troops, tanks and armour, which they are simply not equipped to resist. Will Britain consider supplying Ukraine with the lethal defensive weapons which they have requested, including counter-battery radar, electronic jamming equipment and anti-tank weapons?
We're not at the stage of supplying lethal equipment. We have announced a whole series of non-lethal equipment, night vision goggles, body armour, which we have already said that we would give to Ukraine. Over the course of the next month, we're going to be deploying British service personnel to provide advice and a range of training, from tactical intelligence to logistics to medical care, which is something else that they have asked for. And we'll also be developing an infantry training programme with Ukraine to improve the durability of their forces. This would involve a number of British service personnel. They will be largely they'll be well away from the area of conflict. But I think this is the sort of thing that we should be helping with. Look, I don't say we should rule out forever going further. I think America's thinking carefully about this. But I think we've had National Security Council discussions. We've had very clear decisions that we should be in the space of providing the non-lethal support, the help, the advice. And I think you've heard from the Ukrainians, I would say the same thing. They see us as a very, very strong friend to them. And I think that's where we should be. I think the reason for not going further is we don't believe fundamentally there is some military solution to this issue. There needs to be a diplomatic solution, which I think should be enabled by sanctions and pressure and the economic weight of Europe and America. But obviously where we can help a friend in non-lethal equipment, we should.
The Ukrainians would say to you that whilst we may not see a military solution, it appears that the Russians do. They are simply unable to resist the strength of Russian aggression. And whilst they undoubtedly welcome the aid that we are giving, it is not going to be able to allow them to stop further Russian aggression. Will the government at least consider the possibility of the supply of defensive weapons if this aggression continues?
Well, you could say some of the things we are supplying are helping the Ukrainians with their defence, but I think I would approach the argument in a slightly different way and say, look, I think we're probably in agreement. What we're seeing is Russian-backed aggression, and often these are Russian troops, they're Russian tanks, they're Russian Grad missiles. As I said the other day, you can't buy these things on eBay. These are coming from Russia, and people shouldn't be in any doubt about that. And we've got the intelligence, we've got the pictures, and the world knows that. Sometimes people don't want to see that, but that is the facts. I think what we should be putting into place is a sense that if there is another Debaltseve, then that will trigger a round of sanctions that would be materially different to what we have seen so far. That is what I would like to see. I do think if you look at the effect of the sanctions on Russian banks, on big Russian companies, on the economy, it is having an effect. It hasn't yet changed Russia's behaviour, but it's certainly beginning to change some of, I think, the advice and the thinking that Putin will be getting, because a lot of business people in Russia can see this is a dead end.
Can I explore a little further that point about sanctions? Because you know that the Ukrainians believe that Russia's ambitions do not stop at Donbass. They see a real threat, possibly to Mariupol, even to Kharkiv. If that continues, would Britain consider imposing stronger sanctions, if necessary, going beyond those agreed within Europe, alongside, for instance, America, and in particular the possibility of at least temporary suspension of Russia's membership of the SWIFT interbanking financial messaging system?
I think the short answer to that is yes, we should not rule out those things. Look, if there was major further incursion by Russian-backed forces and effectively Russian forces into Ukraine, we should be clear about what that is. That is trying to dismember a democracy, a member of the United Nations, a sovereign state on the continent of Europe, and it's not acceptable. And so I would hope that the European Union collectively would respond very robustly with new sanctions, including so-called Tier 3 sanctions, really hitting the economy of Russia. But were that not possible, then of course we should look at other avenues as well. Obviously looking at the SWIFT banking issues it's a big decision. But there is a logic for it, which is if Russia is going to leave the rules-based system of the 21st century, then Russia's going to have to start thinking about whether it's going to be in the 21st century system when it comes to investment, when it comes to banking, when it comes to clearinghouses, when it comes to the other things that make our world work. You can't take one part leave one part of the world, the UN Charter, and not destabilising sovereign states and expect to be treated properly by all the other parts of the world. So there's a logic in what you say.
Okay. The Ukrainians have also suggested that the only way of maintaining this ceasefire is the deployment of some kind of international peacekeeping force, both along the contact line and the Ukrainian-Russia border. Is that something which the British government might support?
I think that where we are now is supporting the OSCE observers and boosting them with extra money, extra resources, extra personnel, not least because the OSCE is something that is accepted by Russia as an organisation as well as by Ukraine. I think in terms of peacekeepers, I think that there are lots of problems there. Is there a peace yet to keep? How would you get UN backing when you've got Russia as a permanent member of the Security Council? Where would the troops be drawn from? What would the rules of engagement be? So I think that we're not at that stage yet. I think we should be focusing on the diplomatic sanctions and other pressures to try and make Minsk work. And only if Minsk doesn't work, then we have to look at other things.
Just looking at the longer term, if Ukraine is to have a viable economic future, it is going to need a huge amount of support, as well as the IMF package, which is hopefully now in place. What is your response to the suggestions being put forward by Congressman George Soros, the Ukrainian Employers Federation, for some kind of Marshall Plan, which will provide guarantees against political risk to encourage investment into Ukraine?
I think the IMF programme and the EU contributions are important. I would just make one sort of point, is that, and the Ukrainians would I'd say this to them, so I don't mind saying it when they're not in the room, they have got to deal with issues of corruption and governance, and if you just pour money into that country without reforming the institutions, it will disappear down a black hole very, very quickly, and that's not what we should do. So we should be very hard-headed about this. Although we are their strongest supporter, a very big backer of Ukraine's right to decide its own future, we should be very, very tough about a reform programme, because a good reform programme is worth billions of dollars of aid. And one of the concerns I have is that while I think there are some quite effective reformers now in the government of the Ukraine, there are quite a lot of different plans floating around, and I think we need a sort of unified plan to get behind, which involves dealing with those things before thinking of more money.
Okay. In cash.
Yes, Prime Minister, I just spent several days in Latvia holding the EU presidency, of course, with the European Scrutiny Committee, and by the way, we kept on bumping into the Bundestag European Affairs Committee, who were there at the same time.
A meeting of minds, I'm sure.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, certainly on the fact that we had serious matters to look at and to discuss. Yesterday, on your statement on the EU, I asked you about the need for the United Kingdom to stand up for UK interests as well as those of Europe, as we have so successfully in the past, if I may suggest, over the last 100 years. You replied that we take a key and leading role on EU foreign policy. However, on the one voice issue, which you've just been referring to in relation to the Russian-Ukraine Minsk discussions, the UK was, and indeed you, were excluded from such a role quite explicitly by the German-French Normandy format. Who devised this format, and why was it devised in that way? Federica, just one moment.
No, good point.
Federica Mogherini stated this morning on the Today programme, and I am quoting from what she said, "We decided together not to put the European flag as such at the negotiating table, but to make clear that the efforts by Germany and France were European efforts." No, she didn't say EU. So who insisted that they should negotiate under their own flags, as, for example, Angela Merkel did when she was in the White House having discussions with President Obama with the German flag behind her? Where does this lead our so-called leading role in Europe?
Well, it's a very good question. I'll try not to give a really long answer. But, look, I mean, first of all, we shouldn't be too precious about not being involved in every different set of negotiations. There are lots of different negotiations that take place on this and on other things. And I think there's no point endlessly obsessing about whether or not you're in the room. We have a very clear role when it comes to Ukraine, which you've just heard has won us the support of the Ukrainians, the Baltic states, the Poles, who see us as the most reliable ally on standing up to Russia firmly. The first to say that Russia should be chucked out of the G8, the first to argue for proper sanctions, the first to really demonstrate our support to the Ukrainians. So we've got a very clear role. We shouldn't be worried about that. The Normandy format, if you sort of rewind, how did it come about? Well, it's the clues in the name. It was when we were in Normandy commemorating the heroes of D-Day, and President
my own father, as it happens,
indeed, and my grandfather, President Obama and I actually thought that this was not the moment and the right time to have a sort of round table with Russia and Ukraine. So the discussions went ahead with France and Germany, and I would commend France and Germany for their diplomatic efforts to try to put together a diplomatic package that the Ukrainians and the Russians can support. The key has always been getting the Ukrainians and the Russians in the room together. It matters a bit less, frankly, about who else is there. The key has been getting them to talk to each other. And all credit to them for doing this work. I think what Mrs. Mogherini is saying is, you know, obviously they'd quite like the EU to be in the room as well, but she's saying this is being done on behalf of everyone in a European way, and I suppose that's fair enough. But the key thing is, you know, not just to hold these diplomatic discussions. The key thing is what happens when and if they don't work. And that is where what really matters is, can we persuade the rest of Europe to impose the sanctions? Can we make sure there's a robust response to Russia? And on that, Britain is very much in the vanguard, very much in the lead, and very much listened to by others in Europe, because in the end, when it comes to the knowledge of financial systems and financial sanctions, when it comes to knowledge of the key industries, we probably have as good a situation as anybody else. So don't be precious about always being in the room. What matters is, are we achieving our goals? No, you're never precious, but I think, you know...
in that case, I can move to Mr. Jenkins.
Yes, Prime Minister, you say there's no military solution to this Ukrainian crisis, even though it's brought about by a dictator who clearly believes in military solutions. Recent history would suggest, in the Georgia case, that there is a military solution, because that invasion was halted when the Americans wheeled in the Sixth Fleet into the Black Sea and the invasion abruptly came to a stop. What evidence is there that we can stop this Russian aggression without a similar demonstration of Western military will and resolve?
Well, it's an interesting point. I would take a slightly different lesson from the Georgia experience. I don't think Russia necessarily believed that America was going to intervene militarily. What happened was that, I think the lesson from the Georgia experience is that no consequences followed from Russia's effective dismembering of Georgia and the creation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And that's really the problem, I think, because what should have happened after a sovereign member of the UN goes through that experience is there should be permanent long-term consequences, sanctions and such like, that are put in place so that Russia draws a lesson from what has happened. And that didn't happen, and I think that's part of the problem.
Well, with respect, that answered a different question, which I think was a very good answer, but it was to a different question. The fact is the invasion was stopped because we were prepared to up the ante militarily.
Well, I would argue that it's the upping of the ante, what is the biggest effect we can have, I think, is an economic effect. And I think we should focus on that. I mean, of course, you can take... you look at more military solutions, and of course the Americans are currently looking at should they provide more armaments to the Ukrainian army. And as I've said, we're providing non-lethal equipment. You can, and that's obviously an avenue, and it looks like America is thinking about that quite seriously. My argument is the greatest power we have in respect to this crisis is an economic power, and it's that we should be leveraging.
Thank you.
Moving to Syria. The opening up of the war to degrade and destroy ISIL in Syria does require a policy shift. Would you accept that that a collapse of the Assad regime, which I have to admit is not very likely at the moment, is not currently in the UK's national interest?
I'm not sure I would accept that. I mean, my view is that Assad is one of the great recruiting sergeants of ISIL. Two things helped to bring about ISIL. The brutality of Assad against his own people in Syria and the utter uselessness of the Maliki government in Iraq that was sectarian and only stood for the Shia. That, combined with the poisonous narrative of Islamist extremism, which is a problem for us the world over, Britain included, those two things combined with that narrative to create the ISIL phenomenon that we see. Would is there a solution to ISIL in Syria that involves Assad staying in power? No, there isn't, because he's part of the problem. So if Assad were to go and be replaced, that at least would open up the possibility of some sort of government in Syria that could represent all of the people rather than some of the people. Well, so I'd come about it from a slightly different way.
Well, the alternative scenario is that Assad does go and ISIL fills the vacuum.
Well, I think that I don't think that is realistic, because at the end of the day, we're seeing this in Iraq, where ISIL have lost already 700 square kilometres of territory, where you're beginning to see fractures and problems because they are unbelievably brutal and hideous in what they do. And, the vast majority of people in Syria don't want an ISIL-type regime. They just want a decent, inclusive government. I mean, in the end, all these problems, I think, come back to the same question, which is how can you build inclusive government with the rule of law that isn't corrupt, that's able to have armed forces that represent all of the country and can provide security. That's what we're trying to get in Iraq. I think Abadi is doing a good job and we should back him. And what we need in Syria is the same thing, but it takes longer because we've got Assad in power. So we need to build up the forces of moderate opposition, and we need to bring about a transition where Syria moves from Assad to something better. Now, that's going to take a long time, but I don't think there are any shortcuts. I don't think there are any other routes through this.
I'll come to Iraq in a sec, but who are our natural partners in Syria now? I mean, who are we going to work with? Is there any prospect that we'll turn to the Syrian Kurds?
I think our natural partners in Syria, this will sound a bit trite, but our natural partners in Syria are the overwhelming majority of the Syrian people who want a decent, non-sectarian, inclusive government. And now that includes Syrian Kurds, it includes Sunnis, it must include some Alawites. If there is a transition, and we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves because that's some way off, but were there to be a transition, you'd need a figure or figures to take over from Assad who could take some of the Alawite population with them, as well as appeal to the majority Sunnis.
Okay. Can you update us on the what's going on in Iraq at the moment, both on air and land, and clarify our policy there? We seem to be focusing very much on the military side rather than the political.
What we're doing in Iraq, I mean, there is a fully joined-up strategy. People are frustrated just because these things take time, but it's a fully joined-up strategy of supporting the Iraqi government, which is now less sectarian and more inclusive. It's about trying to help train up the Iraqi security forces, and we're playing our role along with others, particularly in things like counter-IED. But it's also about the air reconnaissance and strike capabilities that we have, that we're providing above the skies of Iraq on a daily basis. I was at RAF Marham last week talking about just this. And the truth is, we're the second largest provider of strikes. We account for more than France and the next two countries, I think, combined. And as well as that, obviously, we've got Voyager aircraft providing air-to-air refueling. We've got intelligence and surveillance aircraft. We've got ships that are involved too. There's a very large British military component playing its part in a international, including Arab countries, strategy. But the military is one part of it. I think where I'm sure more can be done is the sort of diplomatic and political surge to try and help the Iraqi government do what it needs to do.
Do you think we could be doing any more to help the Kurds than we are at the moment? And we've supplied 40 heavy machine guns and some people to train them how to use them. All the help we give them has to go for a rather tortuous route through Baghdad and then up to Erbil. Have you looked at any extra equipment?
Well, we're happy to respond to requests. That's what we've done so far.
Well,
I think actually I don't have the numbers in front of me. Perhaps it might be useful for the committee to provide a note bringing together all of the things we're doing, both in Iraqi Kurdistan and elsewhere across the country. But I mean, I've got here 40 heavy machine guns, £500,000 of ammunition, 50 tons of non-lethal support. We've gifted 1,000 surplus Valon metal detectors, which we were using in Afghanistan, for counter-IED. So in terms of the Peshmerga fighters, we've got 30 experts in the Kurdish region training on counter-IEDs. Perhaps it would be useful to give you a full list of all the things being done, because it is it's an enormous coalition effort involving all these different countries. What I say to the system here is, don't feel you have to do something of everything. Try and work out where the British contribution can be its most significant and helpful. So that's why I was pushed so hard for the vote in Parliament to allow the strike work, because actually if you look at the capabilities of the Tornado aircraft with the Raptor pods and the Brimstone missiles, those are as capable, possibly more capable than anything the Americans have, and they really wanted us to be there to help with that work. So don't feel you've got to do something of everything. Try and work out where we can give the greatest effect and focus on that.
Sticking with the Kurds, they are our most reliable partners out there,
yes.
and a lot of them have died in action there. Yet they weren't invited to the anti-ISIL coalition conference that we had here in London recently. Is there any reason for that? I mean, they went to the Munich Security Conference on an invitation.
Yes. I suspect, I'll have to check this, I suspect that if you have a conference which is a conference of sovereign states, including obviously Iraq and other neighbouring sovereign states, then it is more difficult to have regions as well. I suspect that is the answer, but perhaps I'll include that in my letter to you.
Fine. Just finally, quickly turn to Libya. Libya is in chaos at the moment. There's vast quantities of arms, uncontrolled flows of refugees and migrants, and very clear signs that ISIS is moving in. In your statement yesterday, you mentioned Jonathan Powell's initiative out there in trying to establish a national unity dialogue amongst the various groupings. What are the prospects of success of that, particularly as I gather this morning, one of the groups, the Tobruk government, has actually ruled out working in a dialogue?
Well, it's an extremely difficult situation. There's no denying that. It's not just Jonathan Powell who's working out there. There is a UN Special Representative Liaison, who is conducting talks, including on the 23rd and 24th of February in Morocco. The aim is to bring these different parties into a national unity government, but it's very difficult because there's quite an argument about which ones are beyond the pale in terms of either support for terrorism or support for the narrative that underlines terrorism, and so it's often difficult to get those countries that are most interested in trying to help Libya, whether that is Egypt on the one hand or Qatar on the other, to agree to who should take part. So it is extremely difficult. There's no, again, I'm afraid, sound like a stuck record, there's just no shortcut here. What happened, I would defend our action in Libya in that we responded to the potential of a genocide by Gaddafi, and with allies we stopped that from happening and saved lives. That gave the Libyan people a chance of a better future, but it's a chance that they haven't yet taken. and we need their politicians to demonstrate, and their militia leaders and others, to demonstrate a will to take that chance. And that means they've got to put aside their differences, come together in a national unity government. But it is very difficult.
Thank you.
Sir Malcolm Bruce.
Thank you. You said, well, in your capacity as chair of the post-2015 high-level panel, you talked about the importance of creating effective institutions. You talked about your golden thread of governments, and you've just said we had a dysfunctional government in Iraq and we now have a more unified government. My committee just produced a report on parliamentary strengthening. So can you indicate what you see as the role of working with the parliament, which is now actually an effective institution?
Well, this is the parliament in
Iraq.
In Iraq.
Actually working with MPs is part of the process of helping to build an inclusive Iraq. Do you agree with that? Do you think we should continue to do that?
I do. Look, I think a lot of common themes to all these countries, whether we're talking about Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Nigeria, I mean, all of the areas where you see problems of Islamist extremism bubbling up because you've got ineffective government, a lot of it comes back to not do you hold elections, because lots of countries hold elections, but do you have the building blocks of democracy? Have you got the rule of law? Have you got a proper place for the army in society? Do you have an effective parliament? Do you have a way of calling your government to account? Does your government just represent one bunch of people and extract money from the country for those people, or is it an inclusive government? These are the absolutely vital questions of improving the safety of our world and the prosperity of the people who live in these countries. So Parliament in Iraq, yes.
Yeah. We spend more money on supporting elections than we do on supporting the people who've been elected.
Well, that's something I need to go away and reflect on, because my whole approach has been to say, of course, elections matter, but it's the building blocks of democracy that matter in many ways more. And so, I have made sure that, for instance, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy does get properly funded, because the work we do with political parties is very important.
You've also, well, we looked at conflict prevention, and indeed DFID is more and more focusing on post-conflict states. And it's common knowledge that preventing a conflict saves you an awful lot more money than having to deal with one afterwards. Do you think, therefore, that we're doing enough to actually prevent conflict, or where we've actually managed to sort of get people working together to stop it escalating? And in that context, do you think that the DFID funding should do more about that? You've set up the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, which will have £1 billion next year and will be effectively having its remit set by the National Security Council, which you chair. So can you give us an indication of how that money is going to be deployed in a way that's different to tackle conflict situations?
Well, what's different is that this funding is now properly discussed around the cabinet table with the members of the National Security Council, including the Home Secretary, thinking about domestic security, including the Foreign Secretary, thinking about countries that are broken that need mending, including the Defence Secretary, thinking about how we can help these countries build up their security. And so it's a proper conversation about these countries, the risk they pose to us, and what we can do to try and prevent conflict. So I think it's an excellent thing. I can't tell you how the money will be spent, because we've got to sit around and discuss where it goes, but it tends to go to those sorts of countries like Somalia, where early intervention can prevent breakdown. I mean, I think this goes to a bigger argument, which is, never mind just the conflict and prevention pool, there's an argument which is so much of what we're doing with development and aid is about security. There is no prosperity and development without security. And I think that's one of the ways to explain to people why we think meeting our aid target is so important. Because, if you take one example, Somalia, that country has the capability of delivering to the world drugs, terrorism, mass migration, violence. But on the other hand, if we can stabilise it and improve it, and there have been some steps forward, I'm not saying it's like Switzerland, of course it isn't, but when I first became Prime Minister, there was a massive problem of piracy off the coast of Somalia because of our active intervention and putting armed guards on ships and all the rest of it. That has been radically reduced. So working together, aid and defence and foreign policy, in order to deliver security is very much part of what I'd like another government to do.
We're focusing on these post-conflict states, which are very often dysfunctional and corrupt and difficult to deal with. And if I can perhaps turn to Nigeria, for example.
Yes.
I mean, Sir Richard has talked about ISIS spreading itself across North Africa and indeed into West Africa, Boko Haram trying to link up with them even in Afghanistan. So Nigeria is the most populated country in Africa, huge connections with this country. country. And if it breaks down, if Boko Haram get more and more
disastrous,
people will. This will finish up on our shores. So how are we going to deal with that if it happens, and how are we going to work with whatever agencies we have in Nigeria to try and contain and reverse that situation?
Well, I would say this is a good example of where the National Security Council has made a real difference, because we've had a number of sessions on Nigeria, and so sitting around the table, you've got the Development Secretary, who's got one of the largest development programs in Nigeria of any developed country. You've got our excellent High Commissioner in Nigeria, who comes back to explain what they think is going on the ground. You've got the Secretary of State for Defence, whose tornado pilots are flying over Nigeria with their Raptor pods to try and find the Chibok girls, whose military are involved in assessing what training and assistance we could give to the Nigerian military. You've got the Home Secretary, whose experts in counter-terrorism and security are working with their counterparts in Nigeria. And all of this is being discussed in one place with, as it were, effectively one budget, but maybe we can go even further to that, to make sure that we maximise the impact Britain can have on Nigeria and the political relationship that we have with the Nigerian president. But I mean, if you're saying how's it all going, it's still extremely testing, because Nigeria has massive challenges in terms of governance and corruption and all the rest of it. But I don't think, if you look around Europe, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a country that has got a more joined-up, clear, thought-through approach to what Nigeria needs in terms of help from us.
But Margaret Hodges' committee produced a report on the Private Infrastructure Development Group, the PIDG, which is generally speaking been thought to be a good thing for promoting infrastructure. But it actually says that it had concerns that funds were going to the looting of Nigerian oil revenues. So how can we be sure, operating in Nigeria, that our money is actually delivering what it's intended to do rather than being diverted?
So I missed one person who was sitting around the table when we had the discussion on Nigeria, which is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who of course has a lot of experience in Nigeria, and he came to the meeting and brought his experience of what should be done next. Look, you can never be certain that monies aren't, that there isn't misspending or corruption, and when you're dealing with countries that suffer from corruption, you have to be especially careful. All I would say is I think we are, in terms of aid spending, probably the most transparent country in the world. We now have an independent body that we've established to check how money is spent. But you've always got to. There's no perfect place you're going to get to. You've just got to keep your eye on us.
Yes.
Prime Minister Ban Ki-moon has said that Yemen is collapsing before our eyes and the world can't stand by and watch it happen. And as we know, the President has been forced out of Sana'a. He's now in Aden. The Houthis have taken control. There is a humanitarian crisis, and Al-Qaeda in the South Arabian Peninsula is gaining ground. You and William Hague have played a very important part in ensuring that Yemen stayed on the path of democracy. But now we have a real crisis, the possibility of a civil war. What on earth can we do to save Yemen?
This is, I think, in my experience of trying to work out how you can help countries and try to prevent what's happening from happening. This is thoroughly depressing, in fact one of the most depressing cases, because every normal toolkit from the foreign policy toolkit was applied. A contact group of like-minded countries and neighbours was established, intensive diplomatic advice and support, aid programmes delivered, and all the rest of it. And yet, as you say, you've now got a situation where the Houthis have effectively taken over the north of the country. Is there a president? Isn't there a president? Our embassies had to leave. And it's an extremely difficult situation. Your question is, what can we do next? I think the most important thing is to work with the most important neighbour, which is Saudi Arabia, and to try to work with them to work out how to best provide some level of stability in Yemen. But we're a long way from that, because it is deeply unstable, deeply riven. I think the only thing I would say is, if trying to draw a common theme across all these things, if there's a need for inclusive government with the rule of law that includes the whole country, Yemen is yet another example, because of course, while everyone was trying to get behind a better president than Saleh in Hadi, it was still not an inclusive government that was representing all of the country. You've got the Sunni-Shia split, as demonstrated by the Houthi, and that's where we've ended up.
If you draw that common theme, yesterday you made a statement about the 3 young London girls who've gone to fight in Syria or to support ISIL. Is there an estimate as to how many young people are being radicalised, British citizens who are going on the net and therefore ending up in places like Yemen and Syria and Iraq?
I think there are estimates I can give you about the number of people who have travelled to Syria, and we regularly publish those figures. I think trying to give you a figure for how many people are looking at radicalised content on the internet, that's not a figure that I think we've published, or one that is very easy to estimate.
Might not be one we would find credible.
I thought, I've got a feeling. Well, I'll go away and think about that, and I'll ask the experts. But I've got a feeling it might be one of those figures that has to be quite concocted from estimates, and so therefore doesn't tell us.
But it's a serious problem.
As I said yesterday, it's a hugely serious problem, and it goes to this whole point about trying to recognise that, first of all, everyone is in this battle against Islamist extremism. We can't just say the border force should have stopped them or the police should have intervened. It would have been great if they had done, but the fact is we need the school to be combating extremism. We need the community to be doing as much as it can. That's the point about the whole duty, the prevent duty we're putting on all these institutions, is to say we're all in this together, we've all got to play a role. We also need social media organisations to do more in terms of helping. They are helping take down pages and pages of extremist material, but there is more they can do.
Mr. Jenkins. We change at this point to the other subject we've chosen for discussion today. Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you. Prime Minister, there sometimes seems to be a disconnection between a government's aspirations in a particular area and defining the means to achieve it, the translation of goals into deliverable plans. And I'm thinking of things like and this is common to all governments, stabilisation of Iraq or Afghanistan, or the net migration target, for example. When this does occur, why do you think it happens? How does a government set itself a target which turns out to be unachievable?
I think
what goes wrong with the advice?
This is a very good question. I think there are lots of sorts of goals that are set and goals that are hit and goals that are missed. But I think that there are two quite different ones. One are things that are absolutely within your power. If you say, I am going to deliver a pension that increases with earnings prices or 2.5%, the triple lock, that is absolutely within your power to deliver that, and we have. And I can give you a whole list of things that we said we'd do and we've done. And those are things that are delivered. And I think full credit to the British impartial civil service that help us to deliver these things. Then, of course, there are the goals you set which you want to achieve, for instance, reducing migration, which you have to then marshal all the policies to make that happen. So you put in place a cap on migrants from outside the EU, you change policies and procedures and all the rest of it. But that is different to something which is directly in your control. But if you're asking more generally, why do governments sometimes not achieve their targets? Well, let's get. I think I need to get into specifics because
perhaps if we can think of an example where the system has learned from a failure of this nature.
Yes.
Can you think of an example and what has been learned?
Yes, I can think of lots of examples. Where to start? I mean, why don't we start with a success? That would be nice. I mean, I think there are some very big projects this government has delivered, whether that's the Olympics, whether it's Crossrail. Hang on a second. I'll get there in a minute. Yes, but I think even in successes, you can find out how you can do better. For instance, did we train enough apprentices in order to deliver the Olympics? I think there are always more things you can learn. In terms of things where you learn lessons, I think let's take, for instance, the issue of migration. I think the biggest lesson I would learn is that we need to act more rapidly on the financial draw to Britain. I think that the way the tax credit system and benefit systems work as a massive draw to make Britain, not only because we're creating so many jobs, but also the financial draw, we needed to act on that faster. I made very clear pledges about what will happen in the next Parliament if I'm happy enough to come to another one of these meetings.
Well, I'm glad you thought it was an interesting question. The pressures on government to deal with the real pressing and short-term issues can be very overwhelming. but what parts of Whitehall have you found to be most helpful to get ministers and officials to think about the longer term?
I think, I've said this before, it is a daily battle in government that, because there are so many things that draw you towards the short term that, as Prime Minister, you've got to try and find ways to deal with that stuff, but then try and focus on the longer term things that you want the country to achieve. So what are the things that have helped to do that? I think the National Security Council has helped with that. I think at its best, the top of the British civil service, I think, is good at focusing on, particularly when it comes to the economy and economic and structural reforms, at making sure we focus on those things. The most important thing is to have a plan and to follow it through. So if you take some good examples, education, we had a very clear plan. It was a plan that involved new structures in education in terms of free schools and academies, intolerance of failure, reform of the national curriculum, a radical shrinking of the Department of Education itself. There was a plan, and the plan was very effectively followed through. Now, by two cabinet ministers in welfare, there's been a plan. And I think the way to avoid getting dragged into too much short-term stuff is to have some clear plans on the economy, on welfare and education, and to stick to those plans.
The annual public spending round can easily dominate the agenda and thinking of Whitehall departments from one year to the next. How happy are you that there is also sufficient capacity at the centre of government for coordination of such cross-government plans as you're talking about, and indeed as the Civil Service Chief Executive John Manzoni is thinking and talking about, which address these long-term challenges such as the ageing population, or the systemic risks in the financial system which still threaten us?
I think that, and I know your committee's been looking at this, what matters is when you do a public spending round, that you don't simply think, how do I make the numbers add up for this department, if that's going to harm the goals that we've set either in that department or in another department or somewhere else in Whitehall. So what you need is to make sure as you go through the big spending decisions, and we've done this in the spending rounds, that the Prime Minister and Cabinet Office are involved in the thinking about each department's programme, as well as simply wanting to make sure that you reach financial targets. And so, there's some good examples here. If you take, the Justice Department's had some very exacting targets to meet financially, and yet at the same time, it's currently launching the the rehabilitation revolution in terms of changing the way probation is done and changing the way we help people out of prison into normal life and away from crime. So you can, if you join up Number 10, the Treasury and the Cabinet Office effectively, you can make sure that as you make difficult decisions on public spending, you do it with actually a purpose of effectively reforming government at the same time. So it can be done.
So what do you think needs to be done to improve the joining up?
Well, I think we haven't gone for some massive reform of the way Number 10, Cabinet Office and the Treasury work in terms of some sort of structural reform, but we have brought people together. And the fact that in this government, like almost no other government I've ever experienced, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are on not just speaking terms, but see themselves as working very effectively as a team, makes a very big difference. And I would apply that to Francis Maude and I think two ministers in the Cabinet Office, Oliver Letwin and Francis Maude, has helped because Oliver does a huge amount in coordinating government policy and trying to make sure that we are not making a decision over here which would affect another government programme over there. And Francis has been brilliant at driving change through the civil service, saving money and making sure we're improving the leadership of departments and improving the functions of civil service. So I think I'm a great believer that you can reform systems like mad and draw different lines on the map and organograms and all the rest of it. But actually what you really need is a team of people that have got a common vision about trying to eradicate a budget deficit while at the same time delivering good public services. And that's what we've all been doing.
It's easier to make changes when you're forced to do so by financial stringency, rather than when there is more money around and competing bids are harder to turn down.
It's probably true, but you're always, if you, like me, believe that one of the aims of government should be to give back to the taxpayer, money that is not required, then you should always be pretty tough in terms of public spending.
It's not what happens usually, though, is it?
Well, I don't agree with that, actually. I think, well, I've only been in government for 4.5 years, and it's been the case every time I've been here. I'm always trying to find out, well, how can we make sure we're not spending a penny more than we need to, so that the taxpayer can have their own money to spend as they choose. I mean, a good example is in education. The Department of Education is half the size it was now. Now, I would argue that is a rebuke, as it were, to previous governments who were wandering around with a Department of Education that was twice the size it needed to be. Education standards have gone up. There are more people in good and outstanding schools. We've got vast improvements flowing through the education system with the government department half the size. Now, that's money that belongs to the taxpayer. We should be giving it back to them, and we are.
We'll come back to that in a moment. Mr. Jenkins.
On impartiality, which you praise, one of the hallmarks of our system, we're also seeing in this Parliament Sir Jeremy Hayward's leadership statement, trying to encourage the civil service to develop stronger leadership. But also we see some ministers openly challenging officials for claiming too much autonomy, at the same time as senior officials feel they are being invited to be less than impartial, be more accommodating of ministers' wishes. As Minister for the Civil Service, which is what you are, what do you feel about this tension, and how should it be addressed? Because it has been quite a public theme of this Parliament.
I don't want to sort of appear that that I don't take these things seriously, because I do, but I don't think the problem is as great as your question poses. Of course you get tensions in any government between some ministers and some civil servants. But
some of your ministers think it's very important.
Well, no, I think it's important we reform the civil service so that we keep the best of what is an amazing, impartial, professional, dedicated group of people who have the health of the country as their vocation. We keep the best of that, but we improve where there are weaknesses. So there were weaknesses in project management, in large projects, in digital, in saving money. So take the best, change what needs to be changed. There will be tensions between ministers and civil servants, but I don't know. I see this as a programme that's on track rather than a problem. Maybe if you could be a bit more specific, I might be able to help.
I think I'm going to have to move on, I'm afraid, because I've realised that we're short of time. Mr. Stewart.
Sorry.
Mr. Stewart.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Could you explain how the Academy's programme raises standards in our schools?
Yes, I think two ways. One is all the evidence is that one of the routes to being an effective school is being captain of your own ship, in charge of your own organisation. And so many good schools who've become converter academies have been able to lock in that freedom and lock in that responsibility and put the head teacher in charge, and we've seen in many cases results go up. Second way, and perhaps more important way, is failing schools or schools that are coasting being taken over by academy chains that have a record of turning around schools and improving them. I think those two systems, so the converter academies and the sponsor academies, both of those have helped. Overall, we've got, I think, 1 million children more now in good or outstanding schools. And what I'm excited about is I think there's a culture of improvement and a culture of intolerance of failure that is flowing through our education system. And I see it everywhere from West Oxfordshire to Hackney, to the north of England, to the south, to the west, to the east. I think it's very, very exciting what's happening. And I think some of these academy chains, I think, for instance, the Harris Academy chain, their record of turning around schools is absolutely excellent. And we should be, see these people as pioneers of improving education.
How important do you think the tension is between different oversight and intervention systems? Because historically, state schools came under the local authority, and now you have what I think my committee described as the insurgent academy model in competition with local authorities, so that local authorities have to up their game or risk losing academies forever to schools forever
Yes.
to the academies model. Do you think there's something in that? And if so, would it be right to end that duality and have regional schools commissioners or whoever supervising all schools as one again?
It's a very difficult question. I mean, basically my approach is belief in school autonomy as a good thing. I to be frank, I don't think local authorities historically have played a great role in tackling failing schools. I think far too many schools, and I'd say this in authorities of all different political colours, failing schools have been left year after year in a way that I think is totally unacceptable. I think actually sometimes you get authorities that have got schools that are okay but coasting and aren't really being challenged. And I think the model of comprehensive schools under local authority governance, I think it failed. I think that previous governments recognised it was failing. I think this government's been more radical than most in saying, right, come on then, let's move to a system of school autonomy, of academy chains, of intolerance of failure, of taking over failing schools, of introducing new schools into the state sector to provide both choice and competition. And that is all to the good. But the question then comes, right, okay, how are you going to oversee these schools? Well, I think before we dive into creating a new structure, let's recognise what we're saying to these new, rather more independent schools. We're saying to them, there's a national curriculum, there's testing, there's league tables, there's the publication of results, there's the comparison of one year against another, there's a very rigorous Ofsted inspection regime. As one of the head teachers in my own constituency said to me, he said, look, with all those things, you're going to know whether we're doing well or badly, and you're going to be able to intervene if we fail. Do we need a lot more than that? Well, I think we do need regional schools commissioners, as I've suggested, to be able to lead the intervention process. But I'm wary of creating a whole other accountability structure when the real accountability is our parents voting with their feet to go to these schools because they're providing a great education.
I mean, the expansion of the Academies programme has been a remarkable administrative feat. But going forward, is it sustainable to have more and more autonomous schools centrally funded and regulated?
Well, my answer is, as long as you are intervening on failure very quickly, make that the most important thing. I'm sure that we can find ways to make sure that the schools are properly overseen. But the most important thing is, when something goes wrong, does something happen quickly? I mean, I've got 3 children at an inner London state school. I'm very lucky that I know they're getting a great education, but if that school went wrong, I don't want to wait around for a local authority to maybe get round to it at some stage. I want Ofsted in there, I want a regional schools commissioner to say, governing bodies out, academies in. Every year of your child's education at school is precious, and for some of these children, year after year was wasted. And so let's have a model of rapid intervention backed by regional school commissioners and Ofsted, rather than trying to create some new oversight.
In that spirit, the Education Committee suggested that the Education Funding Agency should not carry out both the regulatory and funding role, and it should be split going forward. Do you think there's something in that?
Well, I'm happy to look at that. I think some people would argue that one of the reasons academy schools, when things do go wrong, are intervened on early is because you've got oversight. The EFA has a role as well as Ofsted, but I'm happy to take that way and have a look.
Thank you. What has been lost by having a split in education between DFE and BIS? And if you're the Prime Minister after May, would you seek to create a single education department again?
I can see the argument both ways. I've not been a great reshuffler of Whitehall departments. I think the most important thing is find good people, tell them what they ought to be doing, and let them get on with the job. And if you think they're doing a good job, reinforce them, and if not, move them. But I can see the argument both ways. Look, the apprentice boost has been a great success for the government, and I think that's demonstrated that you can have something that is both central to education and to our industrial and economic future run out of a different department. I think Nicholas Bowles is playing a very good role between the two departments. I can argue it both ways, and I haven't made up my mind. That's the short answer.
Hodge.
I'm going to go back really where Bernard left us. You talked about people moving in the same direction, and I just want to focus on the structure really of government. And we've done quite a lot of work around the centre of government and how the centre of government works. And I had a correspondence with senior officials in Cabinet Office and Treasury, a letter which said, the high degree of central direction and integration that you appear to recommend does not reflect the model that this government and previous governments have operated. That was their letter, which ministers hadn't seen. And when I drew it to their account, their television, they wrote to me and said, like your committee, we're committed to a model of government where the centre is effective, smart and challenging. We welcome the PAC and NEO's focus on this area. We urge you to continue. So where do you sit on this debate?
Well, I think the ministers are right. Look, I think obviously this letter probably shouldn't have been sent before, this wasn't done in the right way. But I think the answer that you got in the end was the right one, which is, of course, departments have vital aspects of autonomy in that the Cabinet Secretary, for whatever department's got important responsibilities. They need to be able to carry them out. They need to have the freedom and the agency to do that as part of the government's plan. But what Francis Maude and Danny Alexander and everyone is saying to you is, and I think you agree with this, is there are important functions within government, whether it is legal services, whether it is digital, whether it's human resources, whether it's how we manage property. We could do way better, and we are. I think this government's got a really good record in terms of civil service reform, saving money, running digital services, improving how government works. That does need to be driven from the centre. So I would, and I don't think it's a contradiction to say you can have those things driven from the centre and autonomous departments delivering their
There's just
policies.
one issue. I mean, what we feel when we look at it is actually you've got three centres. So you've got your people at number 10, you've got Cabinet Office, and you've got the spending teams in Treasury. And they don't always seem to work very strongly together. So just as an example, I don't believe that Manzoni is in the same room as Nick Macpherson when decisions are being taken over spending reviews, so that they speak really with one voice. And I think we would get better government if they were. And if perhaps, like Governor Up suggested last week, that you might even think, I agree with you about structural reform, you waste a lot of time on it, but I think in this instance, a bit of structural reform merging them all together with the number 10 unit would create a stronger single voice and a more effective centre.
I don't rule out looking at how you can... You're right, there are these three parts. And I don't rule out trying to work out whether there are ways of bringing them even closer together. I would just argue that if you look at how we've carried out spending reviews and decisions, you've seen the proper involvement of Cabinet Office and number 10 with the Treasury, partly because the ministers running the three parts of government work very closely together.
I think the ministers do. I actually do think that, but I think underneath them there is often too much competition.
I hope we've got out a lot of duplication. I think there was a time when there were sort of implementation units everywhere. We've now got one, it's in number 10, and that has a particular function at looking how policy is being implemented and whether what we wanted to happen is happening, including, sort of mystery shopper service. So you absolutely get it from the patient or the parent's point of view. So you mustn't. I think we've ended a lot of duplication, but there's probably more that can be done.
Can I raise an issue which came out of a hearing we had yesterday? We looked at the inspection services across MOJ and Home Office, and the Permanent Secretary at the MOJ said that she decided to proceed with the appointment of Paul McDowell as Chief Inspector of the Probation Service, despite knowing that his wife's company, Sodexo, was a major provider of justice services and would be a strong bidder, and in fact has succeeded in getting 6 of the new probation service contracts. Just before recess, we had the questioning of Lynn Homer on the information that they supplied on the appointments, and what she told us was that whilst ministers had been informed of HSBC's potential tax evasion activities in Switzerland, the department had, and I quote what she said, a very limited responsibility for giving limited information about individuals. Now, those two things have happened recently, and I think what it seems to me is, doesn't that give you a strong case, really, for reviewing the appointments procedures for both ministers and chief inspectors, so that when decisions are made, you really have the full information in front of you?
But let me say a little bit about how it works at the moment, and there's always ways one can improve these things. When it comes to public appointments, like the appointments of chief inspectors or people to the boards of museums or non-department public bodies and all the rest of it, there is a a well-run office linked between number 10 and the Cabinet Office that draws that information together and tries to make sure we are appointing the right people, that we've also trying to make sure that we're appointing more women to important public roles, and keeps a good grip on it and tells departments we want proper information in advance about the processes you're running and who you're and all the rest of it. And that is, I think, better coordinated. Do we always get it right? Does every decision get made? No, of course not. But I think that's how it works, and it's a good way of doing it, so you are coordinating appointments across government. The second point is, when someone is appointed a minister and the processes that are gone through, I think there is a reasonable system of the Cabinet Secretary, or sometimes the Permanent Secretary number 10, providing advice about appointments of external people. And of course, if someone's getting a peerage, then there's a process, the House of Lords Appointments Commission, which is independent of government, talks to HMRC and asks for their advice about that person's tax affairs. That's very important in that case, and indeed in every other case with HMRC, that Prime Ministers and Chancellors and whatever are not told about individuals' tax affairs or individual tax investigations. I mean, that is, and we have to, this is not some dusty arcane idea. In lots of other countries around the world, you know, Prime Ministers order tax investigations into their political opponents. You know, HMRC has a very strict code of operation. I think that's important. Can we improve these things? I'm very happy to look at ideas. But we, you know, in terms of declaration of interest, the conversation ministers are meant to have with permanent secretaries about interest and all those things, it is pretty thorough. You can always make it better. But,
I mean, it's just quite extraordinary that we've had these two cases. I know they're slightly different, where you just think, was the full information there in front of the final person?
I'll have to look. I'll have to look again at the Sodexo point.
Information had been given to the Justice Committee. It might have followed a different course as well.
Did you have a pre-appointment hearing?
We had a pre-appointment.
And you didn't, did you?
No, we didn't. But unfortunately, I'm running short of time, so I must now turn to Mr. Alden.
Prime Minister, you seem to have a policy of decentralisation in England. When do you think you'll get a policy of devolution in England?
Well, it depends how you define
Please feel free.
devolution. I mean, I would say the first step for devolution in England is to put in place the English Votes for English Laws proposal that William Hague has drawn up. And that's an important part of devolution, because that means that just as the Scottish Parliament will vote on issues that are and have the decisive say on issues that are Scottish, so...
Can we get beyond that, though?
Anyway, that's important. That is a very important... It's a big step.
Let's accept it's important, although most people, when you just talk about that, feel rather insulted about it in local government.
I think a lot of people feel rather insulted that this has never been achieved. We've had now a Welsh Assembly and a Scottish Parliament.
Let's assume we achieve it rather than waste too much time repeating it over and over again. Right. What happens on devolution in England after that, Prime Minister?
Well, I think that's a key part of devolution. The rest of devolution in England is, I don't believe in creating regional assemblies. I think it's a bad idea. We got rid of those. I believe in using the machinery of the current setup of local authorities and trying to devolve powers to them, which in large amount we've done, in terms of getting rid of ring fences, in terms of allowing them to spend their money as they choose, in terms of these city deals where we're trying to deliver both money and powers to...
Any statutory independence for local government?
I don't...
Because you can then take it back. That is the difference between decentralisation and devolution.
Yes, but what, you know... I just don't see that. You know, I'm sitting in the pub and I say to someone, we're going to give your local authority the ability to keep the money from the council tax, keep the money when you attract a new business to the area. I can sell that one. I'm going to give you statute. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean?
If you want me to answer the questions, Prime Minister, I'd be very happy, but I think the Chair would not.
But I mean, I know. I mean, I'm being.
But I do know what it means. I can offer, as I did on the last occasion,
yes,
to send you the information from the Select Committee.
I'm sure. I read it and I will read it again.
Which I will do
but
again.
It doesn't, to me, it doesn't. I'm a more practical person.
Okay, let's move on to the Constitutional Convention, which is supported by two of the main parties, and your party, Prime Minister, is looking. It's mentioned a Constitutional Convention in good terms in its evidence to my Select Committee and to William Hague's review, do you see the possibility of getting the civil service now to have a look at the possibility of a constitutional convention and how that might work?
Look, I think there's a case for it, but I mean, I think the problem is, I don't want to get two-party political, but I think one of the two political parties that supports it, and possibly both of them, see it as a way of parking the issue of English votes for English laws rather than delivering it. And I do think I think people just see through that. So let's get on and deliver English votes for English laws, and then if there's something that could bring together people to talk about how to deliver some extra real devolution to the cities of England, the counties of England.
Do we have to be pushed to do devolution for England? Or is it like Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? Do you have to really make a noise, or can we do this because it's right?
Well, we're doing
and we give people liberty in the locality?
Now because it's right. And so everywhere I go, I'm having conversations with, whether it's with Manchester about the Metro Mayor and the additional powers that come with that, whether it's talking to people in Leeds and Sheffield about the same thing. I think there's a very exciting process of devolution taking place in England through the city deals and the local growth deals, and I think we should build on that.
Okay. Can I move on to pre-election contacts with the civil service?
Yes.
I've thanked you publicly for the big step forward in terms of fixed-term parliament. One of the things the fixed-term parliament allows is a little more than the existing 7 months contact with parties with the civil service. My select committee and many others have recommended, now we have a fixed term 5 years, that this could be 12 months. Would you have a look at that, Prime Minister, for next time round? And now that the civil service has a degree of certainty, wouldn't it be helpful for everyone if there was a slightly different, qualitatively different 5th year in a parliament where all the parties were unable to interact with the civil service?
I would happily have a look. I think there's a lot you can do in 6 or 7 months in terms of preparation with government departments, but I'll happily have a look at it.
Right. Thank you, Prime Minister. And finally, after a general election, I'm sure those days in May 2010 remain vivid in your memory. Have you discussed, as your predecessor did, with the Cabinet Secretary, the conditions under which you'd authorise the civil service to support discussions, should they be needed, this time round in May?
Well, of course, as you'd expect, I've had brief discussions with the Cabinet Secretary about the Cabinet Manual and all that's said there. But I'm confident that I think our system is capable of dealing with these things. Not an outcome I'm anticipating or working for, but I think from what I see of our system, it is capable of the flexibility required to respond to all
last time round, the civil service advice was offered, I believe, by the then
yes, it was.
Cabinet Secretary, and the political parties felt it wasn't appropriate. But would you nonetheless allow that same discretion in this coming May?
I certainly allow the discretion. I think it's a matter for those people involved to look at the circumstances and see what they think is necessary.
Then they can give them some good advice on devolution rather than decentralisation.
Well, I strongly believe that politicians, elected politicians, should be making policy, not officials. Officials are there to advise and ministers decide. That's the way it works. And so I don't think you can, I think what worked last time was two parties came together with quite different agendas, but elected politicians were able to sit down and think, right, what is the common agenda? What do we need to do to turn the country round? And good decisions were made about that programme. The vast majority of that programme has been put in place, and the civil service helped because we had rooms that we could meet in and all the rest of it. But in the end, it was elected politicians that rightly made the decisions.
So those politicians, you hope, will have a very clear view about devolution going beyond English votes.
I've got very clear views about devolution. People need to know final political advert that you only get English votes for English laws if I'm Prime Minister after the election, from everything I can gather.
I'm afraid you've not persuaded me, Prime Minister.
Two brief final questions, one from Cash.
Regarding the voting system and the manner in which it operates and in the context of Coreper, for example, the new voting weighting system came into effect on the 1st of November last year, and under the Lisbon Treaty and so on. Now, this applies both in respect of the Council of Ministers and also Coreper. But recently, Coreper has begun to make decisions on its own account. And, for example, on the EU budget, on the 9th of December, and this is pretty massive, I would suggest, the general budget of the draft European Union, a Council press notice was put out indicating the Council had agreed the new 2015 budget when, in fact, it had been endorsed by Coreper. Now, on that basis, it would appear that Coreper are making decisions without reference to the Council, and at other times it appears from our evidence that decision-making processes are being structured so that civil servants, and importantly not ministers, are getting the final say. How can this possibly be reconciled with democratic accountability and ministerial control in the United Kingdom?
Well, my answer to that would be that our representative on Coreper, normally Ivan Rogers, is riding to instructions given to him by the British government, by British government ministers. And so if you're trying to posit that he can take decisions totally independent of the government he works for, he can't. He has to negotiate hard, he has to sometimes think about what compromises to make, but
so
he's
how
all the
does
time...
this Council press notice get put out saying that the Council have agreed it when in fact it had only been endorsed by Coreper?
Well, I don't know about that specific press notice, but all I can tell you is that the email chains from... you're not going to ask for them all to be published, but the email chains from Ivan back to Number 10 and the Treasury and the Foreign Office, you know, that it's a day-to-day process with long communications about if it goes this way, should I vote that way? How do we get this? So the idea that there's some committee in Brussels deciding our future without reference to ministers, that is not the case.
Well, we'll come back to that because that's the evidence that I'm presenting to you.
Right. Okay, well, I'll look at that specific press release. There may be specific circumstances there, but that is the way the system works. And I can tell you he's a very dedicated public servant who absolutely rides to the orders of the British government.
I think it's the system that we're really worried about.
Okay, we get the point. Mr. Vaz.
Prime Minister, I was at a dinner that you spoke at last November when you said that you hoped that in your lifetime you would see an Asian Prime Minister. It won't be me, so don't worry about that. But the issue of diversity in the civil service is a very serious one. In your own party, when you became leader, you had one ethnic minority MP. You've now got 11. However, if you look at the photographs of the permanent and second permanent secretaries, I think there's only one out of 36 who's from the ethnic minority communities. Do you accept that a diverse civil servant will bring additional skills to departments like the Foreign Office, communities and local government? And why don't we have any permanent secretaries who are black or Asian?
But, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with the premise of your question. You know, the work of creating a meritocratic country which is multi-ethnic, where everyone can make it to the top of every profession, whether it's politics, the military, judiciary or the civil service, that work is not complete until you have people at the top of our civil service from different ethnic minority backgrounds. In defence of the civil service, I'd say actually there's been quite a lot of progress. They've gone from, I think, 5% with black and minority ethnic backgrounds at the end of the 1990s to something like 10% now. So progress has been made. If you look you know, there are lots of very talented senior civil servants, including actually ambassadors from different minority ethnic backgrounds. But you're absolutely right, with permanent secretaries, the progress hasn't been fast enough, and we need to make sure that is put right. There's some very talented people who were on the brink of being permanent secretaries who've gone off to run other non-departmental bodies and parts of government, and perhaps I can give you the details of that in a letter, because I talk to these people quite a lot. But I agree. At the end of the day, role models really matter. You need people from our ethnic minority communities to be able to look at those green benches or red benches or civil service or judiciary or military and see that they can make it to the top. And, you know, if the British civil service is a wonderful institution, as I keep saying, but it won't be all it can be until this happens.
Chairman, since I'm asked the last question, could I, on behalf of the committee, as this is the last time you'll be chairing the Liaison Committee, pass on our very best wishes, our thanks for chairing it in such an efficient and a fair way, and to wish you the very best of luck in the future.
Thank you very much.
I should have ruled that out before. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Somebody else will occupy this chair, and we'll be questioning whoever is occupying your chair after the general election.
I hope to be back, as they say, but I've enjoyed these sessions. It does give you a chance to try and explain more about what the government's doing across a broader basis, and I think the way we've moved to having these more specific sessions, I hope you found that helpful. I find it's in terms of accountability, which it also brings about, because I'm having to check all that's happening in these specific areas, it actually is a force for good in government.
And thank you for the follow-up letters, which we get on the details that have come through. Thank you very much indeed. Order.